Chapter 4 will focus on the impact that culture has on development during adolescence and emerging adulthood. Video 1 will focus on the process of socialization and then look at a couple of the most impactful aspects and beliefs about culture from culture during this period. Video 2 will then look at religious beliefs and political ideology during this developmental period. So let's start by talking about socialization. Socialization, broadly speaking, is the process where we learn how to be from the culture around us. The biggest impactor during socialization are cultural beliefs, or the opinions about what's right and wrong and how life should be that stem from an individual's culture. Specifically during adolescence and emerging adulthood, our cultural beliefs are going to determine what we think a teenager is supposed to be like, or what we think an emerging adult is supposed to be like. Cultural beliefs teach us roles or patterns of social positions and relationships that we are supposed to hold. They also teach us gender roles or specific patterns and relationships that we should have and show based on our gender. Beliefs about how a specific gender should look, what kind of careers they should have, what preferences they have, what relationships should look like, and so on and so forth. All of these come from our individual culture. That means that for each individual going through adolescence and emerging adulthood, different aspects of their own life, their religion, the country they live in, their neighborhood, what they're exposed to on social media, what their parents' belief system or cultural beliefs are, will all shape the relationships they form, the choices they make, and how they behave within their own gender. And again, all of this comes through socialization. We actually see an increase in understanding of socialization during adolescence, where teenagers will start understanding what this process looks like and sometimes even rebel against it. So let's look a little bit more at socialization. Again, this is the process by which we learn beliefs and behaviors from our culture. Socialization teaches us how to self-regulate, when to be quiet, when to speak up, when to express emotion, when to stay silent. Socialization teaches us role preparation, going back to those cultural and gender roles, how we should behave, what we should be like. Socialization also teaches us where our meaning, our sense of self, our sense of life satisfaction should come from. We learn all of these norms in two ways, either implicitly or explicitly, meaning that sometimes our social expectations are explicitly stated. We know exactly what they should be. Our parent says, you will do this or else. You will go to college and major in this major. You will go to church every Sunday. Those are all explicit forms of socialization. But much of this process comes implicitly, where it's not stated, but rather consumed passively as we move through our environment. There's a few different ways this happens. The first way we want to look at socialization is based off the value placed on a specific culture when it comes to independence and self-expression. Some cultures highly emphasize these facets of an individual's life. We call that individualism, where an emphasis is placed on socializing an individual to be independent, to be their own person, to value themselves, to express themselves, and to achieve personal gains over other sorts of gains. An individual from an individualistic culture is likely to be told to dedicate their time to better themselves or take a risk that benefits them, even at the expense of time spent with family or pursuing what the family thought they were supposed to do. The key here is that we're emphasizing the individual over the community. Individualism is more common in most Western majority cultures, and it socializes what we call the independent self. This idea that I exist, my self-worth, my self-value comes independently of other people. On the other hand, some cultures are what we call collective. Collectivism is where we emphasize, during socialization, obedience and conformity. fitting in. This is the more predominant culture in most Eastern majority cultures and emphasizes the development of the interdependent self, where I define myself by my groups and relationships. If my family is doing well, I'm doing well. If I'm benefiting my culture, my neighborhood, I'm doing well, rather than that emphasis being put on the individual performance. We know that individualistic cultures tend to use something we call broad socialization, where we're encouraging the development of that individualism, feelings of uniqueness, feelings of self-expression. Broad socializations encourage a broad range of individual differences, where there's lots of options, lots of different career paths, lots of ways to express ourselves, lots of ways to look, to dress. And you get to choose the one that best fits you. Again, this is more common in individualistic cultures. In collectivist cultures, we have a more narrow range of possible socializing outcomes, a narrow range of individual differences. There aren't as many options because we're focusing more on group harmony rather than individual expression. So, collectivism and individualism are two strong driving factors in an individual's socialization. But socialization comes from other sources as well, not just the dominant culture in your country. Our family, our peers, the schools we go to, the communities we live in, where we work, the media we consume, and even legal services we have available to us all shape who we are. A couple of examples of this. Legal systems, things like what you are and are not allowed to do in a community, what you have access to in terms of medical availability, food availability, all of that comes back to how our country is set up, and that informs socialization. What's emphasized, what's not emphasized. You might wonder which of these sources is most important during our developmental stages, and that's an interesting question. We know that during childhood, family, your immediate family, or the family you spend the most time with, is the dominant source of socialization. As we move through adolescence and into early or emerging adulthood, family becomes less and less important. It still matters. It still continues to shape who we are, what we value, what roles we fill. But as we move through this transitional period, these other sources become more and more important. For example, peers are the most important source of socialization during adolescence. So let's look at a few different ways broad and narrow socialization impact each aspect of our social world. In terms of family, we know that broad socialization involves few restrictions and the encouragement of independence. So, a parent from an individualistic culture who's using broad socialization is going to give their child more freedom to discover, to express themselves, to try new things. Whereas family in a narrow socialization is going to focus on obligation to family and respect for adults, more so than allowing a teenager to discover themselves. Peers work in a similar way. With broad socialization, teens actually have more freedom to choose their own friends, whereas narrow socialization typically involves parents playing a large role in that selection, where parents are more likely to tell their teenager who they can and can't befriend. School also follows a similar path. In broad socializing communities, schools have a lot of freedom and emphasis on individual skills, lots of options, different classes you can take, individual attention from teachers. You can take your own course or route through the school. We also see a wider variety of curriculum in schools that involve broad socialization, where, again, the students have more options and there's more variability school to school or class to class. That is not the case with narrow socialization. In countries that have dominant collectivist culture, curriculums are much more standardized, where every single student is learning the exact same thing. They also involve much more strict discipline, where students have less freedom to act up. We're punished much more harshly for deviating from expectation at school when it comes to narrow socialization. One interesting aspect of the relationship between culture and adolescence and emerging adulthood has to do with the specific outcomes of the beliefs and values a culture holds. We call these culture complexes, or a cultural norm coupled with the beliefs that underlie it. If you think about all of the different values, things that your culture emphasizes, places importance on, you can typically draw connections between those beliefs and the specific behavioral or role expectations that we see popping up culture to culture. So, my example of a cultural concept. Think about dating. In the Western world, specifically in the US, dating looks very different than it used to do, and than it still does in other countries. Recently, dating has become very common in Western culture, where you see adolescents and even emerging adulthoods dating, and what used to be a more adult sense of the word, having a significant other, going on dates by themselves, and actually developing those relationships. That's a cultural norm. The rules around dating, the norms around dating, what dating looks like. But the way dating works in the West reflects certain beliefs, certain values held by Western culture. A couple of examples of beliefs that support the cultural norm of dating: the belief that teens should have independence, time not monitored by parents, get to choose their own things. The belief that teens should get to make their own decisions about relationships. Remember a second ago we talked about how parents in narrow cultures are more likely to select their children's friends. That's not the case in individualistic cultures. The belief there is that teens should make their own decisions, and this extends to decisions about relationships. And then another interesting aspect of this specific cultural concept is the belief that sexual experience before marriage is healthy, or at least some degree of that. So these three beliefs support the cultural norm of dating. You're going to be asked to come up with your own culture complex this week in our discussion. Consider things like dating, or different extracurricular activities you might have, ways you spend your time, how you treat your parents, what family traditions you have, what careers you're encouraged to have, all of these different things that are normal for your specific culture, and what beliefs have caused that to become normal. That brings me to the end of video 1. Video 2 will pick up by looking at religious beliefs.